Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon. It's the last session, and just as I walked in, Mshl said, "Don't you have lunch?" And well, we will. A lot of what had is already been covered in the few sessions, in particular in the previous session, and I'm going to skip a lot of them and then focus just the absolute essentials. So it's going to be short and crisp. Well, space, as we've heard time and again today, it's absolutely an essential ingredient in daily lives of every citizen, but more so particularly in the context of security, because the geopolitics and the power politics are ramping up, and the Ukraine conflict is the clear example. It's a war. Ukraine is a proxy. It's a war between the two great powers, US on one side and Russia on the other. And as the power transition theory explains, I think we need to look at it slightly differently in the context of how the new technologies are playing in this particular role, in a particular war. And therefore, the previous session, in this session, the speaker covered Ukraine war quite clearly. I'm just going to mention a few. The war is quite turning out to be quite different, and a lot of lessons we need to draw. It's too early. We will continue to watch that. Communications and Starlink, people have spoken about. Situational awareness is the key, and ISR is playing a major role, and how the US and its allies are providing that kind of capability, as Russia initially carried out a classic a strike to neutralize the air defense and make Ukraine blind. But I think they've overcome that. And the Moscow sinking is another area we need to look at. So the ISR satellite images, because of the commercial entities that have now come in a big way, and everybody's spoken about that, the images are now available in terms of on real-time basis, as well as they come out into the public knowledge, which becomes the open source intelligence. That's one. On 1st of March, within a week after the Russian invasion began, the Ukrainian Vice Prime Minister made an SOS to 8 of the leading commercial entities to provide images so that they can now at least be warned about the Russian approaches and where the Russian axis of attack are developing, etc. And these companies, some of them responded to it. Capella is one of them, which began to actually warn the initial invasion of the Russians itself. And then they gave the images. Of course, except for the last one, MDA, all the others are American companies. And the American government support and the Canadian government support are behind them as well. What's interesting is the Capella, Maxer, and Planet Labs began to actually put together, integrate their images, and give a very, very strong, actionable intelligence inputs to the Ukrainians. That's important. MDA is more interesting. While the other three were using synthetic aperture radar images, MDA was using radar sats and were also integrated into a spy system, spy satellites that they've been operating since 1980s. And they're outside the Canadian government. Now the Canadian government gave them the clearances to provide the critical image requirements to Ukraine. So while there was a massive asymmetry, while initial advantages lay with the Russians, you found that the commercial entities are providing information. And that raises a big question. The question is the power of the commercial entities. What would that happen should a war break out in our environment and these entities play a role? How will that be? There will be a major case is surprise will be a big question mark. Will you be able to achieve the kind of surprise that you're planning for? Second, intelligence is available to the adversary or to us as well. And third is it impacts on your security policies. Threats. So quite naturally, when Elon Musk brought in the internet connectivity to connect everybody to revive the communications, quite naturally the Russians raised the issue that he becomes a very legitimate target. So these entities will also become very legitimate targets in a great power conflict. What happens to a middle power conflict is a question that we need to look at. Harnessing space quite naturally is issues that we all know. The drivers of space capability rests on various factors: power, prestige, national security, economics, and science. The ability to harness space today matters in the ability to deter war, address your security. It matters for the development and, of course, the way a country becomes a technological park. What I call as should you wish to finally reach a stage where you can have technological sovereignty, identify those critical technologies, space will play a major role. And I think Kushwa has actually covered that pretty well. All the other aspects are well known. Everybody else has covered these aspects. Last two is what I will emphasize on. Space resources. Almost the entire activity is dominated in the geospace or the uh, orbits below the geostationary orbits. Space is getting crowded. And therefore, as against the popular perception that space is unlimited, your orbits and spectrum are now getting limited. And there will be a great fight for it. People like Elon Musk have ambitions of putting up 40,000 satellites within the next 20 years. 20 years. Not only will it become a debris, as Anand pointed out earlier, issue, but more importantly, orbits are getting crowded. And therefore, geopolitics comes into play. Who gets to man what slots, who gets to actually put it up, geopolitical power will come into play. Space mining and technologies and deep space explorations are becoming a reality. Again, being pushed, as pointed out by commercial players, but these are going to make a major difference, and I'll touch upon that later. A few data, this has also been covered by the DGDSA. I'll just emphasize on the critical elements of it. 170 countries are involved in the use of satellites, whether they own, operate, rent, or finance, they're involved in that. There are 8,261 satellites that are orbiting. This data is as of 31st January. There is an increase of 11.84% over April 2021. So in the last 3 years, if you've seen, as the data that was brought out earlier, there's been a ramping up in the number of satellites that are going up into space. And that is indicated here. There are active satellites, which are about 4,852. In 2021, the record was a record number of 1807 satellites have been launched, which is an increase of 41.84% from 2020. So look at the exponential increase that's happening right now. In the active satellites, as pointed out earlier again, the communications take up the biggest chunk, 3,135 satellites, and that itself has increased by 71% from the previous year. And this would give you an idea as to what is happening. From an economy perspective, in 2021 is 447 billion. It will touch 1 trillion by 2040, of which the commercial satellites will take 76%. Communications, internet access, they will all grow at a tremendous rate of 25% and 7%. These are important figures. I will leave this out. Why is space critical? Again, it's been covered by previous speakers. I'll touch upon one day the last point to highlight the importance. Communication satellites today are like the railroads of the 19th century, enabling desolate parts of a country to be settled and connecting them with the center of the country. It impacts on state power. States will become more powerful, and with surveillance technologies complementing this, the power of states will also become quite intrusive to a common citizen and, of course, into the world as well. So the Julian Assange's story and the role of US in monitoring virtually every part of the world, space plays a major role in that issue. The rest of it is well known that the space plays critical roles in data flow, in information dominance, operation of financial systems, weather forecasts, your disaster management, and of course, continuous study of the Earth's resources. Considerations on security will impact on these factors, again well known, the ISR, communications, impact on warfighting in terms of command and control, precision, information, and integration. Then the issue of dependency and vulnerability from India's perspective is what we need to look at. Okay, what are our factors that could be vulnerable? In terms of governance, banking, communications become targets, and trade and databases could become vulnerable to the activities. Out of approximately 3,000 satellites in the world, 60% are of dual use, and therefore military applications are there almost in every satellite. Debris has been covered, situational awareness issues have been talked about, vulnerabilities in ground and space, I'll come to that later. And therefore, in terms of war fighting, what is the critical element? ISR, navigation for precision weapons, weather forecast, battle damage assessment, time critical targeting, UAV operations, and strategic communications. The CubeSat has been spoken about by someone in the previous panel, and it's a 1 kg 10 centimeter cube. It's a revolutionary change over the last 10 years to 15 years. And you see that the number of CubeSats are increasing again exponentially from what was between 2003 and 2013, just 99 CubeSats. Today you have, Elon Musk alone has about 2,500 CubeSats orbiting. And this is going to have a major impact on various issues. Navigation is a strategic asset. And what is important is how China has now operationalized Beidou 3. And Beidou 3 is probably, I would rate, as the most modern global satellite navigation system, even against the GPS. And it has security implications because there's a messaging facility that's available. Accuracies over the Asia Pacific is about 8 meters, better than the GPS in open source. And we do not know very much about the precision code that is applicable to the Chinese military. So in the security dimension, two big players are involved. So when we now deal with space strategy, I think we need to factor. China and US are the bigger players. Russia is equally a bigger space agency. While European Space Agency plays with the USA, Russia, China have a collaborative arrangement. But in our terms, in our strategic analysis, we need to look at these two as entities who USA can be friendly at times, but by and large as entities who need to be watched carefully, both in terms of their expertise, capabilities, and their geopolitical strategy. Therefore, the security perspective, ours focuses on protection of our assets, the impact of use of space in warfighting, and removing dependency on critical technologies. And critical technology vulnerability is an important issue that needs to be addressed, which has been covered in the previous session quite well. What are the factors that impact on this entire process? Whether you address technology or infrastructure, finally, what differentiates between major powers that are rising, like the achievements that China has achieved, is that how effective is a national strategy that backs up, whether it's private sector or public sector, and how carefully is that strategy crafted, and what kind of a funding support that is there. So it's a fallacy to understand or to claim that Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos have come up entirely on their own steam and created the breakthroughs that they've done. Yes, they've done, but they're based on, they've achieved business successes in a different domain earlier, and therefore they're able to plow in. But there is a US government, Department of Defense, and US military that's behind much of the strategy that works. And those of you who study the US DARPA structures, a fine book written by many years ago by the US Scientific Advisory Board, which is called Towards New Horizons, will indicate to you how that strategy plays out. And that is very clearly behind each of the capitalist model that generally is propagated is entirely dependent on government support. The military, it's part of the military industrial complex, let me put it that way. And therefore, India's strategy needs to actually figure out that part. How does the government support these startup entrepreneurs as well as the private sector to be able to meet our requirements and devise a strategy is important. Let's look at China's recent achievements. Rapid growth, currently they have 499 satellites. Between 2016 and 20, 207 launches have been done, and they've been doubling the number of launches every 5 years per year. Beidou 3 was operational last year. In terms of ISR capabilities, they pretty much have similar number of satellites exclusively focused on ISR as the US. And Asia Pacific is completely monitored on a continuous basis. About 250 satellites are in the ISR domain. 55 launches in 2021, that was a record. They're going to beat that in 2022 with 60 launches, out of which 6 will be towards the completion of the space station, and they are doing it single-handedly. The success also depends on a variety of launch rockets. The launch rockets cover from light launch to heavy launch, from 2 tons and below to 60 tons and above. And this is an important element which we need to look at as well in our strategy. The launch rockets ability have also diversified in having launched from a platform based on the sea. And that is extremely important as well, because now they can move some of their launches towards the equator to achieve better results. And this sea-based platform launch, which is a Long March 11 that was done last year, is an important issue that we need to remember. The PLA, the Chinese space strategy is driven by the PLA. So there's a singular military focus as the prime, character of that strategy, but it brings in civil quite well and integrates with academia, research institutions, and others as well. So military-civil fusion and the role of strategic support force is a good one to study very carefully and in great detail. Manned spaceflight, space station, landing rovers, Moon and Mars, these geopolitical aspects I will touch upon a little later. But the research is very, very accelerated, because if you see Chinese writings, particularly the Academy of Military Science writings, you'll see their fear that from the Apollo launches time period onwards, the Americans' objective is to dominate the cislunar space and block out the L1, L2, L3 Lagrange points and enable only the American dominance in that region. So this is the reading that they have, not just now, but the readings that they've been having from the 80s onwards. And this is something we need to understand. So the strategy involves now quite well and articulated and an explicit counter space and space control strategy. And space control is an important element of overall strategy. Deep space exploration is a focus and a priority area for them. They are moving towards establishing a moon base by 2030. And the cislunar domination, which they will contest with the Americans, is the issue that actually is an important strategic factor. The cislunar is the combination of Earth, space covering Earth, Moon, and the Lagrange points. It's better explained here. And what is important is it contains a volume which is it contains a volume which is 10 times more, 100 times more, and a scale of economy which will probably touch 10 trillions over a period of next 10 to 20 years. So the involvement of technologies that are maturing with respect to use of cislunar space effectively lies in breakthrough technologies and disruptive technologies like 3D printing, material extractions, and setting up production centers for use of space on space platforms and space stations in space itself. That's why Jeff Bezos talks about setting up factories in orbits. And this space mining concept, which looked very outlandish or which looked like a science fiction, now looks like a reality, because by 2040, 2050 timeframe, you probably might be seeing the first elements of the space mining coming in as a reality. So space, the high ground, has been a point that's been highlighted by the Americans as early as the Gulf War. And therefore, you'll see a consistency in the results that are now showing up in the formation of the Space Force, etc., when you actually look at some of these statements. So Rumsfeld report in 2001 says war in space is inevitable, and they continue to follow that dictum. And the doctrine in US space doctrine focuses on space control, space force enhancement, space support, and space force application. And then they divide the utilization of their space capabilities in 3 categories. Category 1 is activities that involve direct application of force, either from space, within space, or directed against objects in space, from the Earth's surface or atmosphere. And space force application and much of space control fall into this category. The 2 and 3 are not use of force, but using other methods. And for want of time, I'll leave this out. But let us bring out the determinants in the space competition that's emerging right now. As I pointed out, rise of commercial and private players and the technology ramping up that's taking place. There's a rise in deep space exploration. And what is all that doing to launch costs, for example? So the current launch cost, which is $1,500 per kg, which was $65,000 per kg in the 1970s, will drop to $100 per kg in 2040. Thanks to people like Elon Musk on reusable rockets. Right now, they're doing it on the first stage. They will move right up to the payload on a reusable capabilities. And that's how this study indicates that it will drop by 2040. What does that do to the overall space sector? There'll be a flooding of private players and commercial actors into the space domain. And that will have an impact on overall security factor. Satellite market, again, continues to grow at an exponential rate. 70% of the economy is on a satellite market. But the requirement of internet becomes another factor that drives the overall process. And there's a paradigm shift in demand. So the cislunar scope, I said, is 1,000 times the volume of GEO, and the scale of business is at 10 trillion that we are looking at. So if you look at geopolitics of space, in which we need to factor our strategies for harnessing space, then we need to look at few of these factors that have emerged. And there were questions about these in the past. The two important factors. One is the entrepreneurship law in 2015 that the US enacted, which pretty much brings in a territorial claim on moon and other space objects. And the second one is the 2020 Artemis Accords, which pretty much is a geopolitical instrument to bring in dominance in the cislunar space and on the moon planet. And there is a controversial clause in that process, which I think Ranjana will probably cover that, safety zone concept, which literally actually says that once you've established your station, that is your territory. And these are controversial, and therefore Chinese and Russians do not accept that. They've now proposed, and they're working on setting up what's known as the Lunar Research Station, International Lunar Research Station, which pretty much will move into another area of lunar space and work on a similar model, which actually carries forward geopolitical competition onto the lunar surface itself. So the US Space Force, as pointed out in one of the previous panel discussions, is that the commander of the US Space Force just last week clearly articulated that the economic and military domination of cislunar space is the primary objective of the US Space Force. And that will play out into overall strategy on collaborations, partnerships, alliances, as well as conflicts.
What you say, Latu? Hurry up.
Yeah. So let's look at the policy aspects. And my main focus here is that to understand the reality of conflict that's emerging in space and the militarization of space, it is important to divide the ISRO operations as one focused on science exploration and another focused on military. And that will need to be done in two sections, which is one is the internal strategy, which should pretty much of them have already been actioned or they're on the way. But we need to divide clearly the civil and military departments, which addresses military's urgent requirements. For an example, like LEO satellites launch on demand, and that is one. In the external angle, I think we need to understand the reality of space competition and space warfare or space militarization is a reality. And therefore, India needs to take a more proactive role in global policy making. Space as global commons and space governance must be led by neutral players like India effectively, and bring in security as a cooperative model and international collaborative research in areas where all the countries can work in an interdependent manner rather than create vulnerability based on dependencies. I finished with this. Thank you very much.
Thank you.